Chapter 30 Canal de San Quentin. Renoir's brain was still not working right. Each step toward San Quentin and the Siegfried line filled him with dread. Drowning would have been the easier route, but he pressed forward. He sensed the Irish girl close at hand. Caitlin and her new pet had stayed close throughout the day's march. He knew it was her nurse's bedside manner, observing the invalid to see if he fell into desperate straits that would require aid. His mind wandered back to Leonie. He wondered if she had indeed survived. He wondered if the story the demon had dropped into his brain pan was all true. Regardless, he knew whatever her end had been was his fault. He had made promises of security he could not possibly keep, promises that would never have been tested under different circumstances. In ordinary times, he might have skated by with her faithful service without ever having those false promises put to any test. But these were not ordinary times. The test had come. Renoir had failed it, and failed Leonie along with the other women he had suckered in. He put them under his care, used them, in every sense of the word, to enrich himself and cover his gun running, and then he betrayed that trust. Even in vengeance on Sebastian Strothman could not pay back what he owed them for their suffering. Renoir knew it was just a matter of time now before he paid out what was due them with his own blood. The only thing keeping him from lying down by the roadside and waiting for punishment to arrive was Caitlin's watchful nurse's eye. He was ashamed of his vanity. Inside he had given up, but he could hold up a lie with the best of them. He had exposed his weakness to Leonie and the rest. He would not expose it to Caitlin. So he slogged on, his body moving automatically. Renoir felt the remains of water in his ears from the drowning. He twisted his head from side to side, trying to fling it free, but it remained, dampening all incoming sound, elevating the voices inside of his head. The sound began as a gentle hum and built into a quiet, perpetual tingling ring. He blinked his eyes, and it seemed like he saw the remains of her, while his eyes were pressed shut for that millisecond. Leonie. Leonie had ridden the Andalusian stallion hard, away from the manor and the destruction that devoured it in her wake, as Eric and Major Howard rose and slaughtered their comrades. She finally slowed Joshua to a walk and squeezed her cramping, wounded side. It ached terribly. She felt the sticky, cooling blood soaking her left hip. All the muscles around the injury were seized taut from the shock, and their dull throb was spreading up into her back and shoulders. She endured and pressed on, knowing there would be pursuit followed by death if they took her. She could not tell how long she rode or what led Joshua there. But when she looked up, dawn was breaking. Its ephemeral grey light framed a barn. Joshua walked into it as if he was returning home. He dipped his head into a pile of oats. He sniffed at it, then worked a mouthful in and around the steel bit and chewed. Leonie held tight to the horn as she eased her leg over the saddle and dismounted painfully. When her left leg hit the ground, sensation, like a toothache, the length of her entire side, engulfed her. Its hurt was so deep and sharp that she nearly vomited. Leonie rested her head against the warm leather of the saddle and swallowed her acidic spit, wondering how she had ever gotten Joshua into his riding tack. She could not conceive of loosening the girth now and hefting the saddle off. She decided she would find time for that later. She stood tall. Then she fainted. Leonie fell into a heap on the barn floor. She dreamt of Sebastian's arms wrapped around her as she slowly bled out. She did not regain consciousness again. Joshua drank from the trough outside and contentedly munched on the dry oats. He was asleep, standing over her, as her heart finally stopped pumping the meager blood that remained inside her. Leonie Armitage died at dawn on Easter Saturday. Joshua remained steadfast, the only witness to her passing. Renoir startled back to the living when they stopped again. Caitlin's arm touched his shoulder. "We're taking a rest, Alexandra." Renoir sat down by the river and stared into the water, wondering at its depths, imagining falling into it and letting it consume him. If drowning was the death the demons felt fit his crimes, perhaps he ought to simply succumb to it. On the plus side, he could not imagine a bloated, waterlogged corpse coming back to life, and it would be a better death than setting himself on fire. That seemed certain. Caitlin squeezed his shoulder, which snapped him out of his meditation. Then she walked to where the others convened around Francois. "St. Quentin is not far. If that is where the Germans have built their fortifications, we will find them within the hour," Francois said. James glanced at Harlan's watch and smiled. "Well, heck, that puts us there by 3 o'clock. Plenty of time to find a good place to hide out." The others remained subdued. "What?" asked James. Durant shrugged. "I guess we'll know when we get there." James's face crinkled up. "What are we going to know?" "If things went as badly for the Germans on Good Friday as they did for us." James swallowed. He did not have a good answer to that. They ended the rest quickly, rising and pressing on, following Francois's lead. His estimate had been correct. Within the hour, they stood at the front line of the Siegfriedstellung. When they got out of the woodland, they found a 500-yard stretch of clear-cut stumps. Beyond the stumps was a terrifying sight. More barbed wire than any of them had ever seen stretched north and south as far as they could see. It was more than a thicket. It was a metal forest of staked and barbed ringlets. The idea of being sent over the top, running into it with bayonets fixed while shells roared down from the sky and gunfire cracked the surrounding air, was a heart-palpitating proposition. Finbar spoke for all of them. "Fucking hell. Makes you wonder, eh?" "Wonder what?" asked James. "Wonder how many bodies you'd have to pile on that wire to make a walkway that'd get you to the other side." "And it makes you glad," said Finn. "Glad? Goodness gracious, glad of what?" asked James. The wire forest was not making him glad of anything. "Glad it won't be my body on this wire, serving as a footpath for a bunch of British cunts on their way to Berlin." "How do we get through it?" asked Caitlin. Isaiah smiled. "Slow and steady, miss. Slow and steady. At least there ain't no machine guns aiming for murder while we do it." They picked through the wire with care. Beyond it, they climbed past a deep, concrete-reinforced fire trench. 100 yards behind the front line, they found another thick stretch of barbed wire with a reserve trench on the far side of it. They pressed through, past empty support trenches and wire entanglements, abandoned machine gun emplacements, and redouts. It was coming up on 4 o'clock when Renoir, bringing up the rear, finally made it through the last line of wire and onto the parapet of the last trench. James stared back through the rows of fortified ground sown by the German war machine. "What is it?" asked Caitlin. "Feel bad for them cavalrymen. Even if they was with us, no way their horses could get through that mess," said James. "Can't worry about that now," said Durant. "Let's go." They crossed through the trench, crested the rise behind it, and looked down a steep slope at a ribbon of green water that was the Canal de Saint-Quentin. The line of water was 80 yards down, at the bottom of a deforested gorge that ran north and south. 500 yards to the north, the canal disappeared into a tunnel mouth that yawned black beneath a towering wall of earth and granite. Napoleon had ordered the tunnel blasted through the mountain. His loyal subjects eagerly carved and tore it from the earth so that trade might flow. It took 10 years to complete the thing at an immense cost of sweat and blood. When the first barge ran through her in 1810, the Virgin Reichswald Tunnel was a marvel of engineering, the longest tunnel in the world's history. It ran underground for nearly 6 kilometers, conjoining the waters of the Oise and Somme rivers, allowing the intercourse of goods and commodities to flow back and forth through its system of locks and gates with joyful abandon. Come 1914, the German army recognized a good thing when they saw it. They captured Bellicourt and Saint-Quentin, then co-opted the tunnel. She was instantly transformed from the longest tunnel in the history of the world into the largest underground fortress in the history of the world. Floating by the tunnel mouth, a trio of long peniche barges sat, moored to concrete jetties. Beyond the barges, the tunnel mouth was a pitch-black half-circle hanging over the slow-moving water. On the opposite side of the canal, a concrete pathway with the steel lines of a small-gauge railroad track led into it, vanishing into the tunnel's depths. "Well, that looks like a fortification to me," said Finn. "She's the Reichswald Tunnel," said Renoir. "She runs 6 kilometers underground. It is the Canal de Saint-Quentin." Durant nodded. "Right. Let's get down there, take a look." They carefully climbed down the steep gorge to the canal bank and followed it toward the tunnel mouth. 2 of the peniche barges had been roped together, side by side, creating a makeshift bridge across the canal. Francois and Finn led them over it, followed by Durant and Isaiah, then Renoir and James. Caitlin was last, trailed by the mastiff who leapt joyfully from barge to barge and up onto the concrete walkway. Francois and Finn were both stopped at the tunnel entrance. Reflected sunlight lit it for 20 or 30 yards. Beyond that, nothing but impenetrable shadow. "Any of you lot got a flashlight?" asked Finn. No one did. They'd lost most of their equipment in the terror of running the gauntlet the previous night. "Right. There ought to be signal lanterns on the barges," said Finn. He hopped back onto the barge and walked it fore to aft. Within a minute, he'd found a couple kerosene-burning signal lanterns and a box of matches. He struck a match and held it over the wick of one, letting the flame lick up into life. Finbar fired up the second and passed it over to Francois before clearing the gap back to shore. He and Francois led the way, following the little railway into the darkened tunnel. Donnie McMaster was torn. He'd wanted to stay with the Germans. They seemed like nice enough fellows, But given the choice between keeping his motorbike and sticking with them, he had chosen to keep heading east on the motorbike in search of gasoline. He loved his two-wheeled machine and the open road in ways he could never love another human being. If, hopefully when, he found gas, he could always circle back to them if he really wanted company. He hit a nice corner at speed, leaning into it and rolling the throttle up smoothly. He rounded the bend and locked his brakes, sudden and hard, when he saw it. The ass end of the bike spun out from beneath him, faster than thought. The left foot peg was grinding against the earth, his knee was getting burned to strawberry by the road, and the handlebars were chattering and slapping the tank as the motorcycle dragged and bucked against the ground. The slide came to a stop less than a yard from the bodies. Donnie was fast to his feet, grabbing the bars and frame, wrenching his lower back, righting the machine before all the remnants of gas could dump out of the tank. He succeeded on the first try, using adrenaline alone. The pain in his elbow, knee, and hip did not really begin to register until he had the bike settled onto her stand. He got a rush of dizziness and quickly sat down on the road, hitting hard on his butt before a feint could yank him there against his will. Goddamn fucking shit! Goddamn fucking shit! After his heart got back under control and the dizziness passed, he took stock of the damage to the bike. The left foot peg had snapped clean off. Goddamn fucking shit! The handlebars looked bent, which might mean the front forks were done for too. The paint on the gas tank, which Donnie had spent weeks getting just so, was scratched and dented. Goddamn fucking shit! He hollered. His knee and elbow started to burn. He looked down at the wounds. The road rash was indeed severe. His pants were shredded at the knee and hip where they contacted the road. Through the holes there were flashes of raw, bloody flesh, gravel, and wool fibres rubbed deep into it. His elbow was the same mess, and it ached worse than his knee and hip abrasions combined. He held his forearm and looked at the cause, pissing mad. One man was laid out on his back, arms and legs splayed wide, tied off to ropes that staked him to the road. The other man was entirely in the nude, face down on top of him. It looked like they died at the climax of some fantastical sexual act. Donnie squeezed himself as the pain started to flow through him. Goddamn fucking shit. Suddenly, the man on the bottom opened his eyes. Donnie's mind short-circuited. All pain sensation shut down, and Donnie exploded to standing. Hip, knee, and elbow be damned. He staggered backward, struck the motorcycle a glancing blow, nearly knocking it over onto its other side. But Donnie got another adrenaline kick when he touched it and launched himself away, stumbling and crashing back down to his bottom. The man's eyes followed him. "Water, mate. I need water," croaked out of him. Donnie was having none of it. He jumped back up, mounted and kick-started the bike, then rocked forward off its stand. He twisted the throttle, limping the broken machine away down the road, leaving parched Dr. Halstead behind him to die. Donnie rode on, enraged and in pain. Goddamn fucking shit, continued playing in his head, a bizarre mantra that ceased to have any sensible meaning after the first few minutes. The bike was running terribly, listing hard to the left and wobbling. The frame must have bent in the crash when the forks torqued against the ground. Goddamn fucking shit! 5 minutes later, the bike died as the gas ran out. Donnie's broken machine as parched for liquid as Dr. Halstead, staked to the road with Harry Moss's heavy corpse atop him, was also dying. Donnie swapped to the reserve, briefly resurrecting the mortally wounded beast. He rode on. Almost precisely 15 minutes later, the engine coughed, choked, then died for good. Donnie limped the bike to a stop. When he climbed off, his left knee could barely take weight. It had stiffened up over 20 minutes of shaky riding with no foot peg to rest on, and it ached now viciously. Donnie tried to get the bike onto its stand, but he could not. It began to go sideways on him, and when it got past the tipping point, he let go and stood back, letting it crash down onto its side. Goddamn fucking shit. Donnie bent over and took his canteen out of the saddlebag. Then he limped gingerly to the opposite side of the road and carefully sat. He unscrewed the cap and took a deep swallow of the tepid, aluminum-flavored water. He looked at his knee and hip again and spat. Bloody Hamburger stared back at him from the holes in his pants. Donnie fumbled his snot-rag handkerchief out of his blouse pocket. He thought he'd better try to get the wounds clean before the blood congealed around the gravel and strings of wool. He clenched his jaw against the coming pain, then poured the canteen water onto the knee wound. It hurt worse than the initial injury had, but he bit down hard on his molars, soaked the handkerchief, and rinsed what he could of the debris out of the scabby mess. He took a short break, then repeated the exercise on his hip. The elbow was last, most difficult logistically to clean, and by far the most painful. He was afraid he had maybe cracked a bone in there somewhere. It hurt with a type of deep ache that said the bruising on the surface was far from the worst of it. The bursa sac at the tip of the elbow had swollen badly. It had the size and shape of a bright red spare testicle and was just about as ugly. Donnie straightened the arm as far as possible. He drank the last of his canteen and dropped it empty beside him. He took in his vanquished metal steed across the way in its ultimate resting place, and then looked back down at his badly fucked up injuries. It seemed he and the machine were a matching set. Donnie gave up. He lay back on the road and flopped his good arm over his eyes to block out the cold sun. Then Donnie McMaster slept. It was the first he had slumbered since Saturday morning. When they found him, he was still gently snoring.